which is why part of the outer wall is missing and why it looks like it's got this kind of weird double ring like a modern stadium. It wasn't originally like that. It was circular, or at least like an oval. But they started using it to build other things. So they started taking it apart. If they wouldn't have dismantled it, it likely would still be there in almost the same form that it was. Some of the churches, like the one called the Pantheon, which is outside of, I think it's Piazza Navona in Rome, was an old pagan temple. It's got a giant hole in the center, and a few times a year they take rose petals and they drop them through at part of the Mass. It was a temple to all of the gods, the largest freestanding dome in the world for a long time. And, you know, that building is more than 2,000 years old now. Still standing. I don't think it has architectural problems. If you flip the next page to 108, you'll see some examples of Roman building stuff. The top is an example of how they built roads. I wish that modern road builders would pay more attention to Roman stuff, because parts of the Roman Appian Way, for instance, and the Ostian Way, can still be used by cars. Thousands of years later. Again, they were good at this. This was like, Romans weren't great poets, they weren't great playwrights. They copied a lot of Greek stuff. They weren't very good at medicine. They copied a lot of Greek stuff, and then they have their own weird things. But when it came to building, these guys were just about the masters of the universe. They knew what they were doing. There's no modern interstate that lasts 2,000 years. They don't even think of building it that long. And modern vehicles and the weight of them would make things a lot more complicated. I mean, road building is actually really scientific. So it does get more complicated when you move more stuff further. But there's still Roman roads you can use. When you go to Rome, you can walk on them. Like, they're bumpy, and you're kind of like, I don't think I'd take a car on this. It's true. And you could see places, if you go to the Roman Forum outside of the Colosseum, the ruins of ancient Rome, there's a spot on the stone where you can see the place where the horse-drawn carriage wheels cut into the rock. There was a corner that they would turn, and always in the same place, and they did it so often that it actually wore down the rock in that direction. But again, it's still there, several thousand years later. The Romans thought of themselves as the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity, and they wanted to tell the world about it. It's one of the reasons that they wrote about it, but in some sense, it's really incredible. Like, this picture is, on the right, is one of their aqueducts. I think this one was from Spain. And you can tell, I mean, this thing is hundreds of feet high. In cases, they're still standing today, and they would use aqueducts to bring water to cities from highlands in other areas. They would divert rivers. They were one of the first groups of people to do this. The Germanic barbarians don't, right? Like lots of other cultures don't. So the Romans were able to have large cities, and they weren't. And many of these things are still standing today. They still could be functional, other than they're usually lined with lead, and that's kind of frowned upon. You can see one of the bridges. The picture on the bottom right is one of the most fascinating pieces of history. This is from a place in Spain called Las Medullas. There was a mountain there, and this is what's left. The Romans mined the entire mountain. They used a kind of mining that would dissolve some things in water, and they used water to like knock it down and different things, and then they figured out ways to sift it and get the ore that they wanted. But Roman mining is on a scale that's hard to fathom. Nothing in the ancient world was quite so huge. They moved, like this area, I mean, it's, 10,000 feet long. They moved a mountain, and this is just in one spot. When we say like the Romans mined, they were serious about it. They dug. Now, Romans also, they worked their miners really, really hard. So being sent to the Roman mines was a death sentence. I think the average lifespan is 1 year, and no one lives for longer than 2.5. And of course, they're playing with a bunch of toxic materials that they don't really know about. Things like radiation. Because one of the things that's easy to forget in the modern world is that radiation occurs naturally in the ground. Dirt tends to be radioactive. And it's not a big deal until you start concentrating radioactive particles. Like in the western part of the state, they had these, they called them what? Filter socks for the fracking. And the material that came out of the ground, they'd push through the sock to catch it. Those become more radioactive over time because they're sifting through so much dirt, and the radioactive stuff was large enough to be caught in these filter socks. And so, I don't know if you remember, several years ago there were a series of problems that they had with improper disposal of these filter socks from fracking operations. The Romans did that kind of stuff too, you know. They actually liked lead because lead was a relatively pliable metal, and it just turns out that it happens to be bad for you, cause lead poisoning. But they didn't know that. But you could see, like the Romans, they have some technological advances, again, that won't show up for 1,000 years. Rome had a functioning sewer system in the ancient world. Parts of the modern day Roman system are still using the old Roman stuff, and you shouldn't do that. I mean, it was sufficient for several thousand years ago, but modern sewer needs are more dramatic than they were back then. But this helps to control diseases, because one of the most significant inventions that impacted human lifespan was waste disposal. Human waste carries all kinds of diseases, and a lot of them are really, really nasty. So diseases that we don't have to deal with very much, like typhoid fever and diphtheria and some of the other ones, you know, we don't deal with because human waste is taken away and disposed of properly and treated. In the ancient world, those were big deals. So Rome has a functioning sewer system. This won't happen again in Europe until the Renaissance. Like this, that's a significant length of time. Let's see. So Hadrian is the next dude after Trajan. Hadrian builds the famous wall in Britain, and he starts to abandon some of Trajan's conquests. So the empire reaches its physical extent, its geographical extent under Trajan, and after that gradually is marched backwards. Now, Trajan probably expanded a bit too much. They're at the breaking limits of communication. So Hadrian starts to look at, well, you can have all of this land, but how do you defend it? And so that starts to be more of a significant thing. He builds a whole stack of pagan temples in Rome. That was one of the things. Hadrian likes to tour his empire. So one of the other things that's sort of funny is some of the emperors kind of stay in Rome, and other ones are hardly ever in Rome. They move around, and they kind of terrorize the bureaucrats, which is really, really funny. Because it's a lot easier to be the prince of your own kingdom when your boss isn't around. And in the case of Hadrian, he has a habit of just showing up, whether he's announced or not. Like, you know, you're the governor of somewhere, and let's say you've been throwing a few parties and spending money in ways that you're not supposed to, and you all of a sudden get a messenger that the emperor will be here tomorrow. He did stuff like that. And so the Romans thought he was great because all of these things and problems and bureaucracy things, he shows up and they magically get fixed. The governors thought that he was a terrorist and should be locked up. Like, go back to Rome. Go sit in your palace and putz. Leave us alone. He was a great admirer of Greek culture. He starts this Roman thing, like one of the things, like I said, is Roman emperors, they basically did what they wanted to with whomever they wanted to, and lots of it is really gruesome. You can look at the history. We would have lots of problems with it now. And note that many of them kind of go crazy and become super selfish bigots and jerks. Well, when you get everything that you want, guess what happens? you turn into a monster. That old phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is why, as parents, part of the goal is not giving your kids or your grandkids everything they want. Because if you do, they will turn into monsters. That is how people work. You might not like it. You might say, but my grandkids are really sweet. And history would tell you that it doesn't really matter how sweet you think they are. You shouldn't spoil them rotten. It's bad for them. We have to be trained to want what is good. And it's in the time of Hadrian that they start deifying Roman emperors. So they turn them into gods, and they build temples to them that you have to worship at. Remember that old thing about Roman religion and how it's civic and a civil duty? This will have a big deal for Christians. Because the Romans weren't so concerned about the gods per se, but Roman emperor worship becomes a thing. And the Christians say, no. And the Romans treat it like it's a crime against the state because of that link between state stuff and religion. All the political offices were also religious. One of the things that I think is important to discover about history as well is that it's easy to think that our time is the worst that it's ever been and people are the most immoral that they've ever been and the most immoral things are happening. And it's hard to say. We live in an age of so much information that's actually relatively worthless. You know, in some cases we know a lot more about crime, and for instance in the 1920s crime was far higher. You could look back at historical statistics sometimes and like far more people used to be murdered than they are now. It doesn't make it right, but again, it's like we live in an age where so many things are based on impressions. And it's important to realize, like Roman society at this time, like there was a huge group of people practicing homosexuality. That was common. That wasn't frowned upon. That was a normal thing. And they did it en masse. And they practiced pedophilia, and that was considered a normal thing. I mean, there's all of these things that were part and parcel of much of society at these times. And, you know, they kind of make your hair stand on end. It also shows when Christianity is entering a society like this, there's conflicts on many levels. There's the theological stuff about there being one God, but there's also the level of morality. Christianity comes with a much stronger sense of right and wrong than the Romans had. And you know, and I know, that morality isn't easy to work at. Like, you have to fight for it. You have to try and choose it every day. And we have the sacrament of confession because we still screw it up a lot. Well, imagine a society where there's no confession and even less knowledge of right and wrong than we have now. And you're trying to reform the morals of that society. I mean, this isn't even beginning to encounter like the crimes of the Roman military, which were relatively crazy and bad enough that historians don't even always write about them. They just sort of tell the story. But conquering a city, for instance, rape and pillage were normal. Usually all of the men were killed and all of the women and children were sold into slavery. And it was just an across-the-board, instant justice thing. And sometimes they killed women and children too. Like, that was considered part of war. That was a normal thing. Not that it should be, it's just like that's what they did. Hadrian is the one, so the Jews are continuing their revolts in the Holy Land, and by the time of Hadrian, the Romans have had enough. And so they demolish most of the city of Jerusalem and build a temple to Jupiter on top of the Temple Mount. Like, you will stop coming here. You will stop worshiping this God. You will stop being stupid and anti-Roman. That was the Roman idea. This is also the time of the Eleusinian Mysteries. This is one of the mystery religions, and we've talked a little bit before about Roman religion and how it kind of functioned, and bird guts and the whole thing, auguries. And remember that that was very empty. And so people start participating in these mystery religions. The Eleusinian Mysteries are one that we know a bit more about because most of them were secret societies, but this took place in Greece, and it's weird. Like 70s hippies, psychedelic mushroom weird. There's evidence that they did use a psychoactive drink. They've found remains and residue from something that was supposedly used at these mysteries that would be like hallucinogenic mushrooms or some of those kind of compounds. Was something that took many days and was like this giant multi-person orgy thing that involved the sacrifice of animals and maybe people and lots of blood and guts and drinking. And ultimately it was involving the speculation of life after death and the life of the soul. One of their great rituals, which was performed in solemn silence, was cutting open an ear of wheat. Doesn't sound so interesting to me, but hey. It was about giving birth to new life. And again, this is the kind of culture that Christianity is encountering in these early missions. Paganism that is very fatalistic. Everything is determined by fate. These mystery religions that are weird and secretive and use psychoactive drugs. Things that very much involve physical and bodily worship and pleasure, and that had just as much pull then as it does now. And these are the people that are, like, the missionaries are trying to bring the message of the gospel to. So the fact that it doesn't have an easy hearing or that they have to work at it, I hope that makes a little bit of sense. There's a lot going on. And it also should tell you the good old phrase from the book of Ecclesiastes, nothing is new under the sun. We didn't invent all this stuff in the modern world. About the only thing we've invented are more efficient ways to kill people. But human sin is human sin is human sin, and it's the same now as it was then. People are about the same. We just have lots more technological toys. Antoninus Pius, I think we're going to skip him. He's one of the first people that actually leaves a surplus in the Roman treasury. One of the funny things that ends up happening is the emperors decide to spend all the money, and so the next guy has to figure it out. Like, one guy spent all the money, and then you're supposed to pay the army, and the next guy doesn't have it. So what do? Kill a senator and steal their money. This happened repeatedly. They do that a lot. But Antonius Pius, he's liked because he actually leaves a government surplus when he leaves office. Note that this was rare even in the ancient world. People today talk about wanting the government to actually balance the budget. I would agree. I think that would be a good thing. Interest costs are going to be a big deal in the future. They're already a big deal now, but they're going to be a bigger deal in the future. But it turns out that, again, government officials are about the same as they ever were. They like to spend money, and they don't like to try and figure out how to get more. He's one of the only Roman emperors that did this. Marcus Aurelius. Okay, so then there's some great rulers. There's this time that's called the Five Good Emperors. Marcus Aurelius is the last of them. So Antoninus Pius and Hadrian and Trajan, they're probably the five good emperors. That's the period of the most stability, the most commercial success in the Roman Empire. And then all hell breaks loose because there is a major plague called the Antonine Plague, and this one devastates the Roman army. So they seem to have picked it up in the east. It could be smallpox, that's one of the best guesses. Could be measles. Whatever it was fairly deadly. and it starts spreading through the empire. Now, again, it can sound like just words on a page, but you have to stop and think about it. If you have an army, they live in close quarters. They do a lot of things together. It's very, very easy for disease to spread. So the army's going to get things bad. If you're a rural farmer and you live out in the middle of nowhere, are you very likely to be infected by a disease? Not so much. Unless you get it from your cows or your horses or, eat too much dirt, you're pretty safe. But if the army loses a lot of its people, what happens? Universally, you have a breakdown in army discipline, and its strength becomes significantly weaker. And when the army's weak, guess what? Your friends come for dinner with swords. And so this becomes a major, major problem. This is part of why the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent under Trajan, and now they've got this disease that's sweeping through the army and killing a bunch of people. So if you're barbarians, you're like, oh, this is a good time to attack the Romans. Their people are all dead. So they start attacks from different directions. Cities in general are crowded and stuffy and vectors of disease because most of them, unlike Rome, don't have indoor plumbing. And so people start getting sick in cities and diseases. And then when there aren't people to maintain things the way that they're supposed to and to follow the standards that they're supposed to, your water supply gets poisoned and people get parasites. And this one starts to bring about one of the major migrations in the Roman Empire that has far-reaching consequences. A lot of people have to move into the cities from the countryside because more people are dying in the cities than are being born, which means that property is cheap and available. But it also means if you have a bunch of people that move into the city for a better life from the countryside, what happens? What happens to your food production? Your food production starts to tank. And that causes a bigger problem for your cities because they have to import food from the surrounding countryside. Well, now there's not people in the surrounding countryside, and they move into the cities, and cities are vectors for disease, so they get sick. And so the food supply is being decimated. And when the food supply is decimated, and you don't have as much food or as high quality food, what happens? People get sick easier. You see how it becomes this sort of vicious circle? Somewhere between 7.5 and 10 million people die. So somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population dies in these 25 years. Think about what the United States would be like if in the next 25 years we had 35 million deaths. Again, we kind of had panic attacks during COVID, and this would cause major heartburn. Cities are hit the hardest, and it starts to expose the cultural divide as well, because the Western Empire is more rural than the Eastern Empire. Eastern Empire is full of more deserts and difficult landforms and areas that are tougher to live in on your own, and so people tend to congregate together in cities. So more people die in the East, more invasions happen in the East. Some of those far-flung provinces get battled over. So they start to try to figure out culturally what went wrong. And the nearly universal conclusion is everything was fine until those Christians came along and they stopped worshiping Roman gods. And once they stopped worshiping Roman gods, everything went to hell and all these diseases came and now we're being killed. So what should we do? Kill the Christians. Force them to worship Roman gods at the sword. And so it's important to see how the stresses on society and the difficulties that this disease impose on society force people to answer questions in dramatic ways that later history would frown upon. But the same thing is going to play out repeatedly when there's a series of plagues in the 250s under Decius. There will be a disease, it'll start killing somewhere between 10 and 15% of the people, 25 to 50% of the army, and they'll blame the Christians again. You can see that it's people trying to make sense of a world that's falling apart, standing before the difficulty and the uncertainty of the future when things aren't good isn't an easy thing. One example of the degree of this plague is something like 2,000 people a day were dying in the city of Rome. And Rome was probably 500,000 people, maybe 1 million. So they're losing 1,000 people a day, 2,000 people a day. It gets to the point where so many people are dying that they can't even bury them fast enough. They just haul the bodies out of town and drop them in a pile because you can't bury them fast enough, because that ends up being another practice that spreads disease, because the disease doesn't quit just because a person is dead. And so handling piles of dead bodies becomes a problem. And it gets even worse if someone decides to come over with their swords and surround your city and prevent you from going outside of it, because now you have to keep all of the dead people inside with you. And if they're really mean, one of the things that they do is they throw people over the walls with catapults who are dead and diseased so that the city would get infected. So the army is weakened, and one of the other problems is lots of people become protectionist, which decimates Roman trade. And peoples around the world and in border regions look at the Romans and they're like, well, whatever these people did is really bad and has angered the gods, so the best thing we can do is to cut off all trade relationships. Well, that causes more problems too. Army service had to be open to more social classes. They start inviting people that are less Roman, like former barbarians, into the army, and that causes a breakdown in discipline. There's more mercenaries. The social consciousness of people is shaken. These kind of things rock the boat in a way that we haven't felt now. I don't know what it would take in the modern world for something like this to happen, to rock social consciousness to the degree that these kind of things did. COVID could have, if it would have killed about 10 times more people or 100 times more people, and we didn't have a way to stop it and we didn't know what it was, that would have shaken the social consciousness like this. It causes a rearranging of all sorts of things and life. We talked a little bit about Roman sewers and aqueducts. The Romans could be better off because they placed a high priority on clean water and built these aqueducts. But the problem is that you really didn't want to live. The worst place to live in the Roman world was on the first floor, because everyone from above you threw their sewage onto the street. And so the lower you lived on the totem pole, the more sewage you had to deal with. The Romans were also fond of using lead. We talked about that. They used lead piping. Some even used it to line pots where water was stored. It turns out that's really bad. Many Romans likely had lead poisoning, something like 10 times the modern rate, if not even more than that. They drank a lot of alcohol, but part of it was because water was usually bad, and the alcohol in the water did have some virtue of killing some of the bad things in it. So the Romans had this standard of mixing 2 parts wine with 1 part water. They have litter problems. There's no good ways to dispose of trash. And later they pass rules about this. But the Romans were also fond of bathhouses. And this sounds creepy. They were generally considered to be quite immoral, but people didn't have running water or a way to get clean in their own home, so they would gather and congregate in these facilities where there were larger amounts of fresh and clean water, which comes with some challenges. One of them is that those become places that spread disease. Doctors and medicine were not very well thought of by the Romans. The Romans had, their major physician was Galen, and Galen is the one who talks about the four humors in the body: phlegm and yellow bile and black bile and blood. So Galen was like the bleeding and the leeches things and having too much blood and too much of one humor and not enough of another one. But think of how many things, for instance, make pus and infections, and you have a lot more infections and it's a lot worse. It makes a little bit more sense why he would think this. But the basic answer in this world at the time, especially under the Romans, is you don't want to get sick, because if you do, you usually die. They did have some herbal knowledge and things like that, but but it's mixed in with a bunch of superstition and all kinds of other things, and there's no objective measure of results. And so all kinds of stupid stuff gets promulgated as this is the cure for it. You know, you cure your cough by drinking powdered cow's horn mixed with the blood of a cat, you know, that's been walked under the moon and paraded around the temple 3 times. Stuff like that. That was very common. That's how medicine worked. You might be surprised, but just in case you are, it didn't work very well. Lots of people died. So all of this social upheaval leads to the year of 5 emperors. Do you see how the breakdown in society and the problems that diseases cause and the invasion of barbarians on the frontier, like all of that creates all this pressure, and so you have a civil war where there's 5 different rulers in the same year. And it's a mess. When you have civil war, the production of the country is decimated, and all these things become problems. Commodus comes after Marcus Aurelius. He's not very nice. The weather seems to have been a contributing factor. Some areas started to experience drought. The Romans, their empire thrives at a time called the Roman Warm Period, which is from 250 BC to 400 AD. And the climate around the Mediterranean was favorable for growing things and for the development of society. When the climate changes, it causes more problems. Septimus Severus is the first one who names another person as a Caesar. That becomes a title in the government, who's not the emperor. The emperor was called an Augustus from Octavian Augustus. So that was the title for the emperor. A Caesar becomes like a